I've got a topic in mind, but I mostly want to see if we can't generate some conversation in the room. We usually end up like having our talks go all the way to time, and then everyone bolts out the door to get back to work, leaving very little time to actually like talk shop about what we're here to learn about. So I'm mostly going to try to facilitate a conversation rather than just kind of lecture you on an idea or a topic. So in particular, though, I figured we would tackle the idea of let's talk about state in our Angular applications. Figure out what other people, like everyone's doing to manage the state of their application. So to kick things off, I did want to demonstrate just briefly how we deal with state in our Angular class. And so if you haven't seen it, you can actually go to GitHub and see a large portion of our curriculum. The examples that we use from it, they're actually posted online for anyone to see. You don't have to go to this, but if you want to check it out at any point in time, you can go to github.com/AngularBootcamp/ABC, and that will drop you into a list of examples that we use. And as you look through the curriculum, there's various steps that are grouped by like 100s. So there's 100, 200, 300, 400. Each one of those being like a various kind of collection of topics. And when we get to the 400s, it's the largest section that you run into up until that point in time. And so here there are 13 steps on state management in our curriculum. And comparing that to roughly that many leading up to that point in time. So obviously we focus a lot in our class about state management, largely because it's the one thing you can't find how to do in the Angular documentation. So if you actually were to pull up angular.io and try and say something like, what do I do with state, you're going to get practically nothing. So if I bump this up, like they have some things called state, but they're about completely unrelated APIs. So they're talking about like state of an animation, state of a router, things like that. And so it's pretty much left entirely up to us to, as a community, to answer the question of how to manage your application state. So our curriculum, we actually take the approach of there's not one right answer. There's many different kinds of ways you can manage state. And we generally walk them through the process of saying, okay, so what are the types of state that exist in an Angular app? And the examples that we give are there's actually form state. So if you have a heavy form-based application, the user ends up typing in a bunch of information into that form. Sometimes the things that they type into that form, it ends up causing other elements on that page to react to what they've typed in. There's routing-based routing-based state, the navigational state of your application. There's component state, the idea that you might be using a reusable widget on your application. And it might need to know some information about this one particular instance of that UI element on the page. And it might be a different state from its sibling right next to it. And then that culminates with NGRX, which we've now, if you've seen our talks before, you've seen a lot of words about NGRX as a state management solution. So for those that walked in, I was saying how this is actually kind of an experiment, and we're doing something a little bit different where this is basically going to be, let's just all hang out and talk about the various approaches that we've taken, the things that we've seen, the things that we've done in our own applications, and just have a discussion about the trade-offs of it. So it's a kind of an experiment. And so I was just priming that discussion by pulling up the curriculum and saying, here's what we go through in our class. And it's kind of a buffet of ideas that we throw at them. And in the class, we actually dig in and talk about the trade-offs. And so I'm hoping to kind of recreate a similar conversation here. So I'm going to see how this works and just kind of open it up to, so what do you folks use in your Angular apps? Take one step back. Let's make sure who all here is actually working on Angular apps for production use. Okay, so more than half. So we actually got some people here who are able to talk about what they do. So anyone care to volunteer and talk about state management solutions that they use? Sure,
Global state.
Global state. I was actually really curious. I'm like,
No.
hey, if you found something that works.
We primarily use NGRX.
NGRX?
Pretty much everything, yeah. But trying to find that balance of component state versus using the store, finding that balance of reusability and coupling.
Okay. So obviously the kind of the number one question that people have around NGRX is like, well, how do you manage the boilerplate, right? And the bloat. Any ideas on that? Other than
another one. So we kind of took the approach of similar to John Papa's library, like the NGRX data library. We have similar in-house base class that kind of gets rid of a lot of that boilerplate for us. There's still some there, but it's much more manageable.
For our data management state, like our actual, I work with Corey, so we're talking about the same code base. Our entity state is pretty much generated. But with the boilerplate, like, we use feature store dot for feature module, and that's a little simpler where we can put like the state with the actual components that use it. So we have like a family of components for one of our pages, and we have like the state right there, and it has test instead of it being somewhere else with where our rest of our state is. That's really helpful. It's all in one file rather than you have an actions and a state. I think they changed their recommendations from 3 files to just 1 with NGRX.
And how is that scaling for you?
So pretty good.
Yeah.
The for feature cleaned up a lot of the code. It's like prior to that, just like this big state folder for the entire application, like everything was in there. And we had lazy loaded features, which split up the code, but the state was still kind of like clumped. But as soon as we started using that for feature, it's like, okay, the state that's related to this feature is like with that feature code, and it's like broken out. So there's still boilerplate, but it's much easier to digest. Like I open the feature up, it's like components for the feature. If this feature does have a lot of state, like it's right there. It's in one isolated place. So it's just a lot easier to wrap your head around.
Now, does your app have a lot of navigational state in it?
We don't actually maintain navigation state in the NGRX. We do use custom data on our route configs.
Okay.
We do that if it's an account page. We have like a flag in the custom data. That way we know that you have to log in to get to this page.
So is that static data you're providing?
It's basically static data.
So let me pull up something and see if I can't show, I think, what you're talking about. So if I were to go, let's see, I'm just going to pick any one of these that has routing in it. Okay, so this is a tiny little Angular CLI app. And in here we have a routing module. So I think what you're saying is like right here you actually add in an object here for the data.
And then in lots of places in our component or in our app will like observe changes to the, we have a function that takes our route tree and merges them all together into one data object for all the child routes and just merges together. And we can observe that and react to route changes that way.
So we have like a list of features, like 50 features, half of them are behind the account wall. Just like in the route definition, we say like login or like account true.
Like first, one thing we use that, like we have I guess the best example I can come up with off the top of my head, we have a live chat we use, but only on certain pages we want that to show up. So we have one property in that data object, show live chat, and then that component listens to the route data, and when that comes true, it shows itself, and when it goes false, it hides it.
So how do you, or do you need to reconcile that with NGRX?
They're related. They're not together. We don't need to.
Seems to work. Just
separate. That way we don't have to like route change up dispatch an action to NGRX. It's mostly static stuff. so we don't dispatch actions on route changes and stuff like that.
We would probably have to introduce storing route state into NGRX if our data wasn't static.
Yeah.
If it was dynamic. But the majority of our use cases is static. Like we just put that data right there on the route definition.
I have a question. If your data is static, why are you even calling it state? It doesn't state by definition.
I guess it's not.
Yeah. It's more like configuration.
That's the. Yeah, it's more like configuration, but routing was mentioned, and that's what I thought of, even though it's probably an extra state.
Any other approaches? So that's like a kind of pretty heavy use, it sounds like, of NGRX. Now, Lance, I know you're a pretty big fan of NGRX, right?
Yep.
Now, what are you guys doing? I know you're using it on your project.
Yeah, the project we're on is using NGRX for almost everything, I believe. Although yesterday I implemented a feature where I was adding some snack bar that would pop up the first time a component was visible, and so it needed to remember when the component, whether it had been viewed. And my initial instinct was to throw that in NGRX, and then I realized I'm only using it in this one component. I'm adding a whole bunch of code everywhere that's not necessary. And so my next initial thought was, oh, I'll just make it static on that component class. And then I realized I have a module file, and so now it's a property of that module file. And it's initialized to, has not been shown, and the first time it's shown, it's changed there. So there's that tiny bit of state because it's only used by that one specific component. Yeah. I didn't put it in the overall store, but most of our state is in the store.
I have a nuance. So I actually, I was an early adopter of NGRX because I had been using Redux and Elm also. And so I was like, it's maybe like a kind of a queuing situation. I was kind of like, first into that, and now I'm maybe first out. Because Paul's seen me do this, I ruthlessly delete any complexity I think I might not need. And so if the state of the thing does not need the kind of very deep sophistication that NGRX enables, I'm like, standing in line to chop stuff away. So like, I keep state like in the route, it's navigational, and in a component, if it doesn't need to be anywhere else, I would be willing to put it in a global variable if that was okay for the context. Just whatever is the least complexity, the least difficulty, the least code to make the right app is fine with me. There doesn't have to be one answer, I don't think.
Yeah. I think we have like a loose rule in our app that if it's only needed by that component, it doesn't go in NGRX. It's just too much overhead.
So John, so Lance was saying you guys use NGRX a lot. What do you have in terms of navigational state, or do you?
We have a little bit of navigational state. So the navigational state is really, we've got an application where we connect remotely to this tool that we need to interact with, and that requires putting in a server address for the tool, logging in and giving it a tool ID to say which piece of this tool I want to connect to. And so that's a login process that I use navigation for. I store all that in the route so that if they try to do it again, it just automatically does the reconnection process. But once we're inside the application, I don't have any navigational state anymore. It's just one app with some tabs on it.
Like what tab? Should that be part of the navigational state? What tab they're on?
Yeah, we've discussed that, and yeah, I think probably maybe it should. I don't know. It's one of those that doesn't have a hard, quick answer to it. It's if you've got a page with 4 tabs on it, do you need to be able to direct the user to tab number 3 in the URL? That's kind of how I see that navigation-based routing is. Do I want to say where I was when I go back to this page, or do I want to be able to direct the user directly to where I want to go? For something this small, probably not, but that's how I think about it.
We're unlikely to email someone a link to a specific tab for this particular application, so it's not as compelling.
Yeah, I think we do both too. Depends whether we need to jump straight to one step or not, whether we put it in the route.
I actually don't think about the email link case. I think about the bookmark case.
Or the refresh.
I think, well, would it be valuable for, because like kind of one of the amazing things of the web is like that URL can be bookmarked, and would it be useful for a user to be able to like kind of ignore all the routing I set up and just like bookmark what they were looking at? And if that would be valuable, I think Paul and I have kind of coalesced on really broadly enabling that. Yeah. Some pretty good results, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's not just one part of the screen, but it's like filters that you have.
Yeah.
That's something to be really useful. You don't have to go through, every time you pull up the application, you say, okay, go to tab number 2, check these 3 boxes, and then this, and now I see the data I want. Yeah, it'd be awesome to just store that in the URL.
Like if I can bookmark the screen that searches for everybody named John, then I can like almost like create a feature. As a user, I can create a feature of being able to do one click to go to the thing of all the people named John.
Right.
Looks like you were about to ask a question.
No, I was with you. We were talking about the same thing about having the link available in an email to go directly to the specific routing.
Yep. So in case you're not entirely sure what we're talking about when we say like navigational state, storing things in the URL, here's a real quick example, again, from the curriculum, actually the exact same step. The basic idea is that we have a list of employees here, and I'd be able to click on one, and then I'm going to see a detail page about that employee. Here our details are pretty anemic, it's just their ID. But the idea stands is that this particular page right here is driven off of the URL. And so up here I can come in, change that to a 5, and then the screen updates to reflect that I'm showing the details for employee 5. That's what we talk about when we're talking about navigational state. But I'm not sure if it was Kyle or John who just mixed in the idea that it's not just about the routes. Like I could have a form here that I might want to have pre-populated based upon that URL as well.
I think you have a step that you worked on in here that shows that, Paul.
There's a good
You, I found it. We just happened to find it in the last class.
query params.
Yeah,
Query params.
great stuff.
Or you could, or your form thing landed in the.
Yeah.
All right, so I think the food has landed. So while I get this, we can go ahead and take 5 so people can go in, get their food, and come on back.
I saw you work on this. This is much interest.
This is a great stuff and like a code for it. It's just amazingly
Awesome.
amazing answers.
Yeah, go to those sometimes as well.
I was thinking about offering the answer, well, Paul, I keep my state in Firebase. I was
going to be like the one thing I expected no one to actually say.
I didn't realize that. They were located here.
Somewhat. I haven't tried much with Girl. I just want to post the contents in the file from that URL, or put the contents in the file here. Is that correct?
Coworker use my
It is close to correct. I just don't remember for sure the details of whether it's what's in that data-team, but this piece that is often missed. Often APIs like this, it's kind of the content type, and I don't think curls with the content type automatically in your file name. So, like when you're trying to make you search for an example, but somebody will show you the extra thing to say on the content type of the slide of the application based on it.
But you have to like.
I think that's the only tip I have for you. Other than that, I think it looks right, but
It just lets you put the code in right live. That's cool. Yeah, it's nice to see live code work. Yeah, I saw some of your stuff open one time on that. It was curious.
so I have between now and April 1st to release a new library showing how to store your Angular application state in a global variable.
You know, you really should. That'd be hilarious. We do have some stake in global variables.
You've got to find a good name for it, though.
Except you can't. I have a lint rule. I have a lint rule where you can't just do window dot global variable.
Yeah.
You have to go through a global variable helpers class, so it's strongly typed. We do have some global variables.
Because that gives you the illusion that it's better.
Yeah. Well,
Well, I mean,
it keeps me from having to deal with the TypeScript any type.
I mean,
Right.
to a significant extent, a Redux or NGRX store is a global
It
variable.
really is. We use it
Just you
sometimes.
feel better about it because
Like,
you have to type more words around it.
Well, Angular has like the one-way data flow,
Yeah.
but like instead of like, I'm going to pass this as an input to every component down the chain, I'm just going to throw it in the store, and that component, it's a global variable.
Like, how is that not a global variable?
But kind of like, I think I remember when you first talked to me about NGRX stores, and one of the selling points was that you had your state in one place that you could kind of see the overall view of your app.
Well, that's the
And that was one of the selling points.
It's a clear trade-off. You have to be willing to accept the kind of globalness.
Using the Redux dev tool though is really cool. Seeing it all in one place and be able to see
Random beat
which actions were dispatched.
A couple more minutes for people to get their food and get back to the chairs.
Really, only having one copy of the data anyway. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, we actually hit a wall with that in one of our projects where we had this notion that you could be simultaneously working on like several entities at once, and like it was actually a massive amount of state that we needed to gather for each one of those instances. And like, we had to create this like brand new paradigm inside NGRX where we had this like instanced understanding about these entities,
That was really painful.
and it was a nightmare managing that.
you couldn't just have it be an array of things and then have whatever was using it understand which one of those things in the array was.
That's essentially how it shakes out, but you had to like make your reducers in such a way that they understood like which instance of the thing in the array they were reducing. So it was like all of your events basically had to like be annotated with this event actually applies to entity number XYZ.
All your actions have an index on them.
Yeah, you dispatch an action and you say, okay, do this action to this entity in the array.
Yeah, like that's what we did, and like that all sounds easy conceptually, but like when you're in the code for it, it is so easy to get turned around, and and you're trying to figure out like how many, like you could actually like make it so that you're like when you're trying to do that immutably also, you end up with this complexity of like, wait, did I just rebuild the entity or the whole array, or did I like accidentally like lose a thing off of my array when I rebuilt the whole array? It was just like, it was a mess to
Yeah,
get
you
it
can't
actually
assign a
done.
reducer to an index.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it has to rebuild the whole thing, every time.
Yeah. All right, so
That's interesting. I wonder if that's actually
You
true.
didn't have a concept of a
It might not be
entity
true,
that might
actually,
change the state
because index is just a property.
to the right thing.
no, because like the idea was that there was like multiple current entities.
So the trick would be making it so that it's for any number, right? 0 to infinity.
Yeah, so you have to register a new reducer to be added new item.
Right. Or you would have to have a way to specify a reducer for a set of properties rather than a single one.
Yeah.
So I'm going to demo real quick just another example of what we say by navigational state, and I'm going to likely keep going back to navigational state as kind of the thing I'm looking for when I talk to people about their app, because I often find like they're not using it enough, and like the more I use it, the happier I become in my Angular development, and so I'm going to kind of keep pressing that as I evangelize like how to use Angular throughout the world. So this step is all about capturing query parameters, and query parameters in Angular are different from route parameters. Route parameters are a way of saying, I want to go to this exact screen while capturing these details for a particular entity. And if I don't have a particular entity captured, it is invalid to even be on that page. Whereas the idea behind route parameters is that I can be using a route parameter from any screen on my application, and its existence is totally optional. And so it's just an extra piece of data, more or less, that you can attach to the end of your URL. And so this step right here takes advantage of that, and it shows the APIs for how to tap into that with Angular. And though this doesn't seem like navigational state, you can think of this user story of, okay, first you navigate to the employee list, and then you fill out a name. And while this is not like traditional navigational state, it's still steps the user had to do towards doing their job. So like their job is not to like search for Brian all day long. It's to do something to Brian. It's to run a report on Brian. It's to modify some data about Brian. And so they had to first find a way to like drill down and find Brian. And so you can kind of reframe your mind to think about this search as being part of your navigation towards your goal of actually being able to find and execute something against Brian. And so with that reframing in mind, we think, okay, yeah, I can actually go ahead and just put up in my URL a query parameter called filter and then throw Brian in there. And now what that gives us is what we were talking about earlier with the whole bookmarkability, the whole refreshing of the page. If I refresh the page right now, I've had to do some work in code I've not shown, but I actually have this control tied to what's in my URL. And so I could actually come up to my URL and change the term up here. And I don't remember, I think Young was another name in here. If I hit enter, you actually see that that comes down into my app as well. Furthermore, I could also sort by a particular column. And lo and behold, I can store that up there as well. So I'm not only capturing my filter, but also my sort by, and then that gets sucked in and used inside my control. And so this right here, a lot of people would start looking at the features and functionality on here, and if they're using NGRX, they kind of get stuck in an NGRX rut. And they think, okay, I'm going to need my store. I'm going to need something that captures the search parameters and search queries for my employee list, and they add those objects, those properties to an object in their store. They'll have an employee list feature, a reducer, and they'll end up having all that complexity and all that boilerplate. When really, like, you just need a couple of values up in your URL, and you just need to tie to that here. And so that's why I keep harping on the navigational state when I'm asking people, what are you using, and then what is your navigational state? Because a lot of times you can rethink what you're doing in terms of navigational state.
That's a good way to think of it. We talked about bookmarking and sending somebody a URL, but if my browser crashes or if I hit F5 and I want to be in the same place, that's where you need to put that state.
This is a great app. I really like apps that work like this. Because if I needed to work on all the Youngs, like I could bookmark that and I'd be one click away from getting back there.
Yeah.
It's really great.
So we also see that this works really well if you're dealing with like reporting features in your application. Because people love being able to bookmark the parameters for their reports. That way they don't have to go in and fill out their weekly summary report information every single time. Yeah.
Another good use case for this company I work for has a pretty large support staff, and the customers they help are not always tech savvy. So like really well structured URLs that like map to like view, like how the view is rendered is really helpful for them, because when someone calls in like, how do I get to XYZ feature or like to this certain screen, they can the support team can just send a link in the chat and it takes them directly to the screen. They don't have to try to walk through, oh, click this, then scroll down and click this, and you'll finally get to it. It's just a single link, they get there. So it helps them a lot.
So I'm going to tell on Stephen Fluent. He's what's his title exactly?
Developer advocate.
He's the developer advocate for the Angular team at Google. And we were talking with him one day and talking about state management. And he confessed that like one time he actually took his entire application state and a giant JSON object, stringified it through an URL. We thought he was crazy, and then we tried it for ourselves, and we were like, awesome, this ain't bad. And it actually worked really, really well. And you have like every piece of state in your application now can be stored in that URL, and you get back to any particular spot like Corey was describing. Now, of course, you're going to eventually run into the URL size limits, but
yeah, especially if you have entities in your state, like your API results.
Yeah. But yeah, so even some of the members of the Angular team are thinking real hard about like, how often and how far can I use this URL to do that? Any other questions, comments, inputs on thoughts with this navigational state?
Yeah. We had a customer, who I won't name because we're very nice about not naming customers, who actually didn't like this feature and felt like the refresh button should throw away all the choices you made inside the page you're on. And so there's kind of different people have different assumptions coming in of how an application should behave.
Yeah, I could see that. You look at it as a reset.
Yeah. Whereas I would generally like it to preserve as much as possible, and if I need a reset, actually have a button on there that takes me back to a fresh state.
I was going to say, what's your approach on telling them how that's wrong?
Well, you can encourage people in a good direction, but you can't make them think the opposite of what they think. So.
It's also useful then to make the URL as readable then as possible, so that the users can hopefully learn from it and say, oh, if I want to go back to this, I can just go back to this URL and get back to it.
Well, I like when the site's designed out. I'm not a normal computer user, but I like when I can see how a URL is structured in an application that I've never used this program before, but I can figure out as I'm using it what parts of the URL need to change to get to different places. If your URLs are structured well, then the users will be able to do that and go in and change their filter term in the URL, and it works.
Yeah, and I think that would be an ideal world to get to.
Yeah.
But I am totally willing to munge up that URL if it means my application is simplified.
Well, we have a search page on our site, and we throw all of your search options in the URL as separate query options, but some of them are enum values, so you have no idea what 0, 1, and 2 mean, but we do.
I forget what it's called, but there's a special part in you can put in the URL that'll, I guess it's used for state for a individual component. It's not necessarily
auxiliary route.
Yeah, I remember seeing it.
Auxiliary routes and there's matrix parameters.
Yeah, matrix parameters.
Oh yeah, I forgot about matrix parameters.
And so, I think correct me if I'm wrong. Matrix parameters, you tap into those when you have sibling routes that need separate route parameters, right? Is that how that works?
No, that's auxiliary, I think.
Matrix parameters are parameters on a specific route segment. So instead of being stuff hanging off the end that applies to the whole thing, if you had /customers/ whatever, you could have a parameter that applies only to that first. It's slash, then a word, then a semicolon, and some parameters before the next slash. So I've never seen their use in the wild.
And then an auxiliary parameter is a parenthesis and then the name.
Yeah, those are really weird.
They're really weird.
Yeah, that's what
I tried using them one time and I couldn't figure it out.
Yeah, so this would be an example of the global variable version of using the URL for your state. Apparently, there's tooling out there that the matrix parameters and the
auxiliary is you have two side-by-side components and they each have their own route. So you have the route to your side component as the auxiliary route. There's an example of that in Mango.io, I think. What?
If you have route questions, ask Paul.
Unless your questions are about matrix parameters or auxiliary routes, then I will read the documentation with you and we'll discover it together.
You've answered my question. Nobody's found them useful.
I thought they would be useful at some point, but then I decided it was too difficult.
Yeah, certainly. Well, the router in Angular has this really interesting characteristic about it, where it's technically the data structure for it is an actual tree.
Yeah.
And so, even though our URL is this linear path, the actual in-memory model of it is a tree-like structure because of the fact that you can have sibling routes. You can have one route that says, now on this particular URL, show the master display over here and the detail display over here, and have those two things routing independently of one another. And so that's a split in your URL tree, where you are simultaneously on multiple paths in your application. And so a side effect that kind of reverberates through the rest of the router API because of that fact is that it is very, very nailed up to an exact component. It's each component in your hierarchy knows about this activated route idea, to where it knows about exactly its portion of this URL. And so when you start trying to tie in things like, well, I just want like this, the component above it and the component below it to all have information, all have access to the same piece of navigational information, then both your matrix parameters, and your auxiliary parameters aren't even a thing to talk about here, but your route parameters and your matrix parameters like kind of go out the window as a viable option, unless you want to like manually traverse and parse your URL tree, which is a nightmare trying to keep that straight, especially if you like just simply redo your URL structure just a little bit and you're in hot water again. And so 9 times out of 10, I give up and I just put it as a query param if I want multiple pieces of my component hierarchy to have access to the same piece of navigation state.
Query params are generally, there's just one set of query params, but like the route data, like the individual like route params, you give it a name. With the child routes, like we have like our city page, it's a /mo/St. Louis, and then you can go to a sale view and it has an ID attached to the end, but it's a child route. So we do have this thing where we can take the activated route and merge all of the parent route data into one object, so we can access all of the data params instead of having to figure out, okay, it's the third child or the third parent it's where this one is. We'll just put them all together. It's really slow.
As long as they use different names.
As long as they're different names, then you don't have to worry about, okay, it's the third one up in the tree.
Yeah. All right, so let's try and leave route parameters alone for a little bit. Any other state management techniques out there? We touched on NGRX briefly, and we've hit routing quite a bit.
GraphQL. Yeah, although GraphQL can manage much of your state for you.
We heavily use Apollo. I haven't taken advantage of the client side pieces of it yet to maintain app state.
You see the new thing came out like today or yesterday?
I have, but we're a couple versions back.
It looks amazing.
Mm-hmm.
The new thing in what?
New version of Apollo GraphQL. Okay. They like greatly enhanced their client side system. It's like it like does so much for you. We have never used it though, right?
Not often.
A little bit. Yeah, we used it a little bit.
We can't get a lot of the problem there is that in the enterprise we're having a hard time like getting clients to see the value of like shaping and thinking about their data in that way, and even harder time getting them to have any kind of confidence that they'll have an internal team that can take that up and run with it after it's in production.
Yeah, a lot of our work is for kind of big orgs.
Right.
And a lot of big orgs are still like thinking about, they're like moving toward REST and JSON.
Yeah, they should just skip that.
You're like,
it makes it so much easier.
Why are you still moving toward REST and JSON? Like, we moved toward that like 5 years ago.
Yeah, so where we originally, we went down the NGRX store path for just about everything. It became very unwieldy with making graph calls and just trying to store that in the global store. And then when we started using Apollo to do those calls, we just skipped it. We just took advantage of their caching, and that's made life a lot better for those components that use that. But then when you get a mix of the NGRX store and this stuff, it's just there's a toss up with what stuff you put in the global state.
I remember us having a big issue with we don't use GraphQL. We have a custom REST API that we built that you can request it and you can include child properties on it. But like figuring out how to store that in NGRX, we had a huge problem with like normalizing that. We ended up there was a library called Normalizer out there, but I don't remember what specifically that problem. We ended up writing our own.
Yeah, Apollo's nice in that sense because if you have one part of your app that just needs a subset of data, and then another part that needs the rest, it's good at merging those into the store.
Yeah, we pretty much ended up building our own for that, so I'll look into that.
Is anyone out there using Angular's form API?
Reactive Forms or Gmail?
Sure, we'll go with Reactive Forms. So, a couple people.
We use Reactive Forms pretty heavily.
And do you guys view that as a source of application state?
We don't put form state in NGRX, but
yes.
But we do.
whether you view it that way or not.
don't know. Do we view it as a we?
What do you mean by your question?
Yeah.
So,
Do you view the form state as part of your global application state, or
I might
as
give an example. I was on a project a few months ago where it was basically just a big form with some tabs across the top, but it looked to the user as though each tab was a different form, but in fact, it was all one big form group. And so as you clicked between the different parts of the application, we were feeding sub-trees of the form group tree. So, form group can have form controls in it, it can have arrays, it can also have other form groups. So we were basically just slicing up different parts of the tree for the different pages. So the overall state for the overall app was held in one form group as you went between different parts of the screen, and then when you hit submit at the end, it had access to everything right there. And so there was not a backing NGRX or anything like that to have control of the state for a multi-page app.
So it wasn't just like a wizard where all the steps were in one big form group?
Kind of. Depends how many lines of code were saved by doing that.
I don't know if we do that. We do that in one place.
And didn't we delete like thousands of lines of NGRX code?
Yeah, well, they had started trying to figure out NGRX, but they didn't. The client had tried to do it, and they had a non-working NGRX part. But then we said, you don't need all that because this is all just a big form, even though it's split between multiple pages and from the user perspective, multiple forms. It's all just one big data. And on one page, it would need information that the user had put in on the previous page. Well, you have access to the whole form group. All that state is there. So
we did the exact same thing. Like we started out with like just components that had some child forms, and like the components were doing inputs and outputs back and forth. Like, oh, this is kind of unwieldy. We'll do NGRX. Like that kind of work, but it's still unwieldy.
I feel like it was like
we came to that. Yeah, like we came to that realization. It's like it was like a wizard type thing. It was like 5 steps, and each page got several forms. It's like, well, just make one giant form builder, split it out into subforms. And then just as you tab through, like this form builder is gathering up more and more data, and then at the very end, you have your entire form tree with all the values, validation checked, hit submit, save the data. And like the forms API held on to the state of that entire wizard. We never even had to touch NGRX.
I remember even like with one page, it wasn't even multiple pages that had multiple separate. It looked like one form to the user, but the way we did it is there was like some pieces of the form was also used on another page, so we wanted to put that in its own component and share it. And then we tried to like tie it together with inputs and outputs, and it was horrible. So we ended up figuring out how to do the subform thing, and it was amazing.
We deleted a lot of it.
Yeah, deleted a lot of code when we figured that out.
And so, I go back to your question, like, what did I mean with my original question of like, what do you mean about having a form, act as state management? Kind of fundamentally, like the philosophical, what is state, what is state in your application? Well, if you have a form on there and a user types something in, like you've captured some state. Like, you may have done literally nothing with that piece of information, and like until they hit a button later on, and your application may not respond to their typing at all. But in the philosophical sense, like the state of your application has changed the second the user interacts with your controls. And so, to me, like the state of your form actually encompasses much more than just the value, right? And in fact, if we go to another step here, let me see if I can't find it real quick. Let's see, component state, nope, reactive forms. Is the one?
Naming is hard.
Yeah, this is the one. Yeah, so this is a step where we talk about the form API in Angular. And the state about this is more than just the values that have been typed in. There's also state about, like, has the user interacted with anything yet? Have they typed anything into any of these fields? Are the fields pristine? Furthermore, there's questions like, well, what about the aggregate of all of these things? So is the form as a whole been interacted with? Has the form itself had any of its internal values changed? And fortunately, the Angular API actually does for you all of the work of maintaining that state. It's just a matter of like letting it do it and utilizing it. And so it also contains a state like, is this control, is its value in a valid state or not? And so I can come down here, for example, and start typing in a bogus phone number, and this turned red. And it didn't just know to turn red. It is actually interacting, taking the user's interaction, and the Angular API is saying, okay, I've seen that you've said this must match a particular pattern from the user, and if it doesn't, that's invalid. And so rather than us writing a code to say, okay, what is the input? Does the input match this XYZ format? If so, go save the fact that it's invalid somewhere. We don't have to write any of that. The form API automatically does that for us, and we just have to tap into it. And so if you have a form and you have a form control or a form group on your application, like you are tracking a bunch of state about your application, whether you realize it or not. And so it's just a matter of how much are you leveraging that object as it sits on your page versus like manually carrying information out of that into some other solution. Right. Any other interesting form stories out there?
I would just echo that Reactive Forms are such an amazing feature of Angular, and as far as I can tell, none of the other competitors to Angular have anything in this space. I think I saw one third-party add-on for React that was slightly similar, but I don't think the competitors to Angular even consider this a feature of value for their checklist. And I think it's just an amazing. Everything you said, it's just an amazing feature. How much you can get it to do for you instead of doing it yourself.
One thing that we have done with some of our forms is you can, the form state is exposed as observables. You have state changes and value changes and all that as an observable. One thing that we discovered, we had one form where we had a radio button, and depending on what option you selected, you had to fill out different fields. So we actually listened to the form state in our template to show and hide other controls. So we actually subscribe to a specific, we do form, whatever control, value changes, and we can use that in the template to show and hide other parts of the form. And that was pretty cool because we were actually reacting to the form changes in the template.
And that's directly analogous to if I had it in the store, NGRX store, and I have a selector that slices out that piece, and I respond to that. The form API is just
you don't need to.
There you go. It automatically is doing the reducing and doing all the state tracking and also exposing changes as observables. So it's this tiny microcosm of NGRX thing, just with the dedicated purpose of making it easily connectable to your template.
Yeah, and with that showing it red, one of our business requirements was not only does it need to show red, but some of our forms are pretty long. And we need to show that a specific thing is invalid down at the bottom of the form. So we use that. We listen to the validity observable, I don't remember what it's actually called, to show the messages at the bottom of the page too.
Right.
But you probably already showed that while I was not.
I don't think I have. I'm just trying to get it now into a valid state. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. See what else is required here. I didn't bother putting the markers on for required. There we go. So so this Boolean property right here, that is an observable that you can actually access it either way. You can access it as an observable or just simply bind to the states, the form's validity property. Yeah, Lance.
You used the phrase NGRX Lite, which made me think of NGXS. Anyone in here use that?
What is that?
I've played with it. I've played with it as well.
I've played with it.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, as someone who used NGRX didn't like it. There were aspects of it that he thought were too ungainly. So he created a competitor called NGXS. And unfortunately, the naming, in my opinion, is horrible because NGRX and NGXS, which one did I say first? They sound too similar. But there's reasons that he went with the naming. But it's very much like NGRX. It's the same basic principle, but things are reorganized differently. You can get your information out of the store as just a scalar instead of an observable, which is kind of nice. He's collapsed the concepts of effects and reducers together. He uses decorators a lot more, so you're defining a lot more in decorators. So it's just a different approach to programming, but it kind of gets you to the same thing. and it was kind of a big splash when it came out in February or whatever. I haven't heard that much about it lately, and I was just wondering if anyone else had used it.
No, but being able to get the value of the state out as just a value instead of an observable, I hadn't needed to do that for a long time, and then I did. And you actually can do that with NGRX. It's kind of a hack. They used to support it, but then they took it out saying it's an anti-pattern. And I'm like, I understand that it's an anti-pattern, but if you know what you're doing, you can. I did like a pipe first on my store. I did this store pipe first, and in the subscribe I sent it to a value, and then I just returned that value. That subscription runs synchronously, by the way. You can get the value out synchronously.
All right. Well, we have about 7 minutes left, so I want to make sure we have some time for people to be able to strike up any kind of conversations one-on-one. This seems like it went great to me. We've had a conversation going back and forth, hit many topics on state management. So I think the experiment was a success. So I'll go ahead and shut it down there, and we can keep talking offline.
Thanks, Paul.